My sermon is entitled, My Father's Business. Now, I just read a translation of the Bible that used the phrase, my Father's house. I think you all know what I mean. You've heard over the years this phrase, don't you know I must be about my Father's business? How many people have heard that form? Right? And sometimes we hear, I must be in my Father's house. I had some other titles selected, but I wasn't sure. You know, we have to get the sermon title in by Tuesday. And by the time the sermon is written, right about now, and finished, this title might change. I had some other ones came to mind, like Tween in the Temple. Or how about Teen Spirit? Smells like? That's for those fans of Paradise. I mean Nirvana. And finally, I was thinking about the presence of the Lord, because we heard about how Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. And our first hymn said, surely the presence of the Lord is here. Right? And we're going to hear a song by Eric Clapton a little bit later called Presence of the Lord. But I like my Father's business. When I saw house and business, I said, wait a minute, what word are they translating? There is no word. The original Greek says, don't you know I must be about my Father's? And the idea of things is implied but not stated. So you have to be a real Greek scholar to make sense out of this. But business and house are not bad ways to communicate this cryptic message. He's in the temple, God's house, and he's already teaching from the Word, which is God's business. We just came through Christmas. I don't have to tell you. The mystery and wonder of the Incarnation, a divine event cast in the form of a human birth. One of the many lessons of the Incarnation is that of the humanity of God. It's perhaps the biggest lesson. Now, it was always known in the Jewish tradition that human beings were created in the image of God from the very beginning. But this point about God's humanity takes on a new turn and significance here. Because at Christmas we have not just a human being created in the image of God. We have God recreating himself in the image of humanity, taking on the human form, moving through the human experience, and revealing that truly human nature, capital H, of which we are but an image. Right? If human beings are an image of God, then God must be truly human. We understand that the divine Creator entered fully into the human creation, born like other people, not pre-programmed to succeed, but created to grow through stages in freedom and according to reason. We also know the Christmas story does not occur on its own. It is part of a much larger story, the story of the Jewish people, the Hebrew Scriptures. Right? The Christmas story makes one and is of a piece with all that came before it. For the Jewish people, the Hebrew Scriptures gave them their law, their religion, and their history. We think of these three things as separate disciplines, right? Let's look at the religion, let's look at law, let's look at history. For the Jews, they did not exist as three separate things. I'm trying to think of some kind of dish that contains three ingredients, but once they're all mixed up and cooked, you can't tell that they're in there. That's sort of the reverse of what we need to look at the Jewish Scriptures as. This is where they got their law, religion, and history. One comprehensive and compelling picture into the meaning and purpose of life. This was Jesus' worldview. This is his starting point. In the spirit of the psalm we read earlier, we see Jesus already firmly grounded in the Word in the Hebrew Scriptures. The same Scriptures he would use when he began his ministry by struggling in the wilderness, armed only with every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The same Scriptures that he would interpret to his followers on the road to Emmaus, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. The same scriptures that he would repeatedly claim to fulfill in his own lifetime. The same scriptures that were under discussion in the temple. What else would they be talking about? The purpose of human life is to grow spiritually, to embody the good and true, to receive the love and wisdom of God and reflect it back into the world and to our neighbors, to be united with God and our neighbor. The scriptures, along with the church and its teachings and practices, are given to us to facilitate this process of spiritual growth into the image of God. But if we want to know what is good and true, we must open ourselves to the source of the good and the true, the divine love and wisdom of God. We must prepare ourselves for God to enter into us, just as the soil must be prepared to receive the word, the seed of life. How is this preparation done? Here's a line I could have probably gotten away with in college, right? Swedenborg's epistemological framework anticipated much in modern developmental psychology. I learned how to do that. A lot of good it does. What it means is that Swedenborg had a view, an understanding of knowledge and how we learn that was very new at his time, but very familiar today. And it was simply the idea that our minds develop according to discernible stages or patterns of growth. And we know this almost like common sense. Infancy, childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and maturity. We know that each individual moves through these stages in their own unique way, but they're more or less there, and they're good markers to map development. Swedenborg actually writes a great deal on this topic because it's quite complex. Think of all the times we have changed and transformed and moved from one worldview to another. But we can summarize his thoughts rather simply as consisting of three distinct stages. We learn first with knowledge, then we move to understanding or intelligence, and then comes wisdom. The learning process begins with knowledge, which he compares with stone and rock. We might think of information, facts, data, concrete, discernible things, measurable. All of the facts in the world merely provide material for the next level of the mind to work on. Our understanding, our reason, making sense of things, putting things together. Rationality comes from the word ratio. To be reasonable means you can compare one thing to another and judge their relationship. And finally, our understanding and sense provide material for the next level of the mind to work on. Wisdom, value, and purpose. Now that I understand this thing, what do I do with it? Now, each of these levels of the mind is quite complex, as I said, and the transition between them even more so. And there is no timeline according to which this process unfolds. In fact, it's happening all the time. It happens in little ways. Probably today, some of you will learn a new fact. And you might consider, what does this fact mean? How does it fit in with all the other things I know? True or false? Informative or not? And once we begin to think and reason, we can then proceed to integrate it into our lives, to use it, right? The stage of wisdom. But it also happens in a much larger arc over the course of our lives. And the arc that we are all once on and are on now is the same arc that Jesus entered into. Our first years are spent learning a lot of facts. Think grammar school and early high school. Then we are led to think and reason about such things. In late high school, college, and later, we discuss and argue with our friends, and maybe not so much friends. We deliberate. We try to understand and make sense out of the world. And if we're not careful, we might get a little bit too intelligent, right? Think we know all the answers. But if we pursue our understanding with humility and honesty, we begin to mature. We begin to discern the purpose of what we know and understand. We become wise and we pursue mercy, compassion, and use. When you are about 12, give or take, right? You start to reason for yourself. As we move from childhood to adolescence, it only takes a couple days, right? Oh no, it goes on for a long, long time. And this was Jesus in our story today. His knowledge base was the Word, and he was already beginning to move toward understanding its inner spiritual meaning. This story represents a critical stage of growth for Jesus and ourselves. Several things are happening here. Jesus begins to think for himself. His unique individuality is emerging. He separates from his natural parents, mother and father, and he moves toward his spiritual parents, God, Yahweh and the temple, the Lord and his church. And all of this at a time of radical transformation, which we know as puberty. The parallel is not accidental, and it's not equivalent either. It's what we call a correspondence. You can see the dynamics of one in the dynamics of the other. Puberty is a physical transformation that happens naturally without our effort. It happens to us, right? Rationality, this move from knowledge to truly understanding our world, is a psychological transformation that only happens spiritually, in freedom, and intentionally. We have to do it. This is the work that we have all been invited to accomplish, the path to walk. Now we know that maturity happened a lot quicker back in Jesus' time. There were fewer comforts and lots of survival incentives. We think of, and so we see Jesus in the temple at 12, we say, isn't that kind of young? Well, for back then, maybe not so much. In fact, Judaism still has the bar mitzvah. At age 13, the child becomes a man. And a central part of the bar mitzvah, as many of you know, is for the child man, the teenager, to recite scripture in the original Hebrew. Right? This is really key. Without this, without knowing the scriptures in their original sense and knowing them well, you really, you can't claim that Judaistic title. Now, many of us know, with a smile, the good faith efforts that many young Jewish teens make, give their effort to this exercise every year, their bar mitzvah. I don't know if any of you have been to a bar mitzvah and seen a young 13-year-old. He's been working for a long time to get that pronunciation right, and he's doing his best. Well, we can imagine that Jesus and many of his contemporaries had a much more intimate knowledge of the scriptures, which defined them as a people. They knew the language. There was nothing else to distract them. They were taught this from morning till night, every day of their lives. He really knew the scriptures. This is, in fact, referenced in our story symbolically in the number 12. He's 12 years old. Many of us know that the number 12 is really central in the Bible, right? 12 sons, 12 tribes, 12 disciples, 12 gates to the holy city. In these and other instances, the number 12 refers to a state of fullness or completion. It's where we get a dozen eggs instead of 12 in many ways. There's something about the different ways that 12 can be divided. That's also important. But fullness and completeness is a key to understanding the number 12, and in this case, 12 symbolizes the Lord's initiation and introduction into all the things of heaven and the church. This was a young boy who was reaching a point of where he could finally begin to understand himself as a spiritual being, unique and a child of God. 12 refers not to his chronological age, but to the extent of his knowledge. It may also indicate the end of this stage of development. As we say, he moved through these stages rather quickly and cleanly, so by 12, childhood was probably becoming a distant memory. To conclude, the story of young Jesus in the temple is like a snapshot that represents and points to all the learning that Jesus was engaged in as he grew. We can think of it as Jesus' first step into the inner life. Now, he just puts his toe in the water, right? Because he would remain in the outer stage of life, adolescence, later adolescence, for the next 18 years, obedient to his natural parents. As inner growth and transformation does not occur quickly, nor does separation from our parents. It goes back and forth. And much later, as we know, he would achieve spiritual adulthood at his baptism and spiritual maturity at the cross. So this one small glimpse into his early years, which many people are often very dissatisfied with, say, why don't we know more? We're given everything we need to know symbolically in this compressed story, which echoes, the story of Samuel and the whole Jewish tradition, and points forward to a life of growing into the image of God. What is true for Jesus is true for us. This is our path cleared for us by the Lord, beginning with the Word, to increase in wisdom and in years. Translated, that means to continue advance through the stages of life, step by step, to grow up in the presence of the Lord.